value. And the spurs are what are critical. One of the other recent mistakes of the town was let's make it cheaper, so they got rid of a whole bunch of the spurs that were in the feasibility study that I developed for the trail. Well, I identified that they have disconnected almost 1,500 bedrooms, which in 1, 2, and 3 bedroom apartment type situations that would have been connected to the trail. Think of how many people that is. It's well over 2,000 people, or probably 10% of the community of the town is now being cut off from the trail, or is going to have to drive their car a quarter mile, find a place to park to get on the trail to use it, rather than just walking out their door and using it.
I want to welcome Don Byrne, who I've known for many moons now. Don is a retired computer consultant and early supporter of the Rail to Trail movement. As a child, he explored the abandoned Chicago Aurora and Elgin electric rail line, suburban line, trolley line, that later became the Illinois Prairie Path, where he met May Watts, the founder, the original proposer, who wrote an essay in the Chicago Tribune paper in 1963. Why don't we try to save this old interurban line? And so she succeeded, and it was one of the earliest rails to trails in the United States. After moving to Massachusetts, Don settled along the old former Boston and Worcester airline trolley corridor and became advocates. He became an advocate for it in the early 1990s for its conversion into a shared use path. Over the years, he has worked with state agencies, businesses, and municipalities to advance trail projects, contributing concept plans, feasibility studies, and advocacy papers that continue to shape local rail trail development. Thank you, Don, for coming here today. I've been excited and waiting for this to happen. This is all great to have you here today. We're going to have some talking points to engage, developing trails on incomplete rights of way, designing trails as networks, not just individual little lines, trail construction and developers and municipalities. Yes, sometimes that's complicated. Then we'll go through some questions later. Let's go in the early here. How do you navigate corridors that overlap active utilities? Usually the railroads were there, and then they sold utility rights, and then the utilities sometimes or sometimes not are in charge. How do you overlap with them? What's been your history there?
I used probably the most challenging utility in the state. Before building the shared use path, was working on a townwide walking trail network. And I approached National Grid about going across one of their pieces of land. I was told, why would you want a trail when you can walk on a sidewalk? The woman in charge of the real estate.
But I know her. I used to know her, yes. The one who's retired in the last few years.
Yep. Anyway, after a few years, we found out that they wanted to expand their high tension line with a second high tension line next to it. And since that involved federal, and in this case, support, they said, you've got to work with environmentalists and try to protect a little of the land or something. So they came back. They knew me because I kept asking. And they came back, and we sat down with the lawyers, and the lawyers were like being typical lawyers. And the first thing they said was, you got to understand, we may be able to give you some of the land, but we have the right to come on if there's a tree near where our power line is and cut it down if it looks like it's going to fall over. And I saw the perfect opportunity. I said, we own the land on the other side where you already have your power line and you don't have those rights from us. Why don't, as part of the agreement we work out here, we'll incorporate that you can go on to our land on the other side and cut down those trees without having to come to us or do any other legal stuff. And all of a sudden lawyers are going, you'll do that for us? And we became buddies. In fact, they even said, if you've got any questions about any other corridors in the town, talk to us. They gave us, and I actually did verify that at least one corridor that was going to become part of what was BWALT, that was a sign that said N-Grid. And it turned out, I said, I don't think it's N-Grid property. And they went and verified, and they said, yeah, somebody illegally put up a sign just to not, and it wasn't N-Grid property.
Wow.
They only had rights to drive in, work on their power line, and
That's
they were
funny.
very friendly.
The National Grid is the second largest owner of dead steam railroad corridor in Massachusetts, second to the state or through the MBTAs. But it's very interesting. They've really come a long way coming around to these ideas. They are actually, in 2009, the entire real estate department of National Grid was at the bill signing ceremony with then Governor Patrick when they changed the recreational use statutes to allow, if your company or even naming railroads and utilities into these rec use statutes, saying that if the utility opens their land to right of way for public access for a trail, then they have no liability. They were part of the conversation inside the state legislature to change those regulations. And I have the whole layout of it on one of my websites. So they've really come a long way in the last 25 years on this stuff. They really have come around.
Yeah.
This is interesting. I didn't know, did you know of what's it called? The Albany Hudson Electric Trail in eastern New York?
I've heard of it, but I haven't had a chance to see it.
Okay, because that would be a good thing to have them come to we're earlier talking about setting up a series of monthly meetings and have a speaker come in as part of your monthly meeting. I know people out there that would come in and be a part of that conversation just because you have a trolley corridor. It's so unusual, a trolley corridor. People say, what does that mean? What's the difference? Well, I'm not going to talk about that today other than let's continue on our conversation here. What unique challenges, Don, come with combining trolleys, aqueducts, and old roads? We're talking trolleys here, but you also have underground aqueduct corridors, some in service, some are abandoned, that are owned by the Water Resources Authority. Tell us about that angle.
That's a challenge. Fortunately, years ago, I actually dealt with MWRA to build, again, the walking path. And the first success I had was in the town of Southborough. They had a trail called the Aqueduct Trail, and it wasn't very long, and it was following much of the old aqueduct and the reservoir in Southborough. They had an agreement that maybe they could get another quarter mile. And they asked me, they said, you're dealing with these guys. Can you come out with us when we're walking it? And I said, fine. And I took the attitude, okay, MWRA may have some real issues and value. You don't assume that it's just no. And we walked a quarter mile, and they said, yeah, we don't see a problem here. And I said, okay, I want to understand the problem. So why don't we walk a little further to the next road and you can point out problems to me? And they couldn't point out any problems. And so I turned to them and I said, why can't we go to here? And they said, I guess we can. And we kept doing that day. And it was supposed to be a quarter mile. We got 2 miles out of them that. Just never saying, let us do this. It was just like, okay, explain why we can't do it. And in the end, they decided they could until we got close to what was in their filtration plant. And long term, we successfully built a trail through the middle of their filtration plant where all the water for the city of Boston goes through that plant. If you attack that plant and were to do something nasty, it would turn off all the water. And we have a walking trail right through the middle of
That's still operational today?
Yeah, it is still where all the water goes.
Here's
But
an,
the other thing on the trolleys and aqueducts that you should be aware of is, and the big thing is, rail lines. I worked for a railroad for 2 summers in the engineering department, laying out track, and some of which is now actually a shared use path in northern Illinois.
Mm.
But at the but aqueducts, old roads, even trolley lines weren't built to the same standards as railroads. And when we're trying to build a shared use path and we want it to be able to handle all kinds of bicycles, be ADA accessible, you've got to think about these things, because things like grades and the curves and the sight lines when you get to a crossing are not there necessarily what you get for free, because the railroads have done a good job to make sure everything was safe. And for instance, in building Buwald, I took our town DPW director and other people out to walk a piece, and they said, "Oh, we can just slap it down immediately." There's a 7.5% grade on that, which is not going to be a yay. And yet, by accident, the town gave away most of the very wide corridor. And now we're having to try to get it back so that we could do a switch back or do some grading to get it to work. And
What
they
year
are
was
thinking,
that give back? What year was that, do you think?
what, that
They gave away parts of the right way width?
basically they signed, technically the land was owned by the business, and the business, and they decided, working with the business, oh, we don't want to impose on them. So they made it a 20-foot wide easement when I had specified 75 feet, which is what the width of the grade was.
Is it going to be difficult to reassemble that correctly, or has it been built on there? Or?
It hasn't been built on. We can do it, but there's been a number of cases where, I hate to say it, but the easements in town, almost every easement in town has flaws and needs to be redone, because nobody was thinking all the challenges you have with engineering a trail or making it a linear path.
Yep, you're not alone, Don. You're not alone. Let's go on to something else here. With designing trails as networks, I know that just by the definition of what you're doing here with the trolleys in some places and aqueduct lines in others, and then roads interconnecting them, that network is really is what makes it impactful, and not just a little trail that's dead ends and doesn't do anything. Why are spurs and connections critical to long-term trail success? Tell me your thoughts on that.
If you go back, I've read various documents and things about trails for a long time, and people define trails by various points. But one of the points that always shows up is the trail useful. And to me, being useful is people have a reason to be on the trail. Not recreation is a great one, but there's more to that, especially where in this trolley line that is close always to a very busy 4 to 6 lane highway, which is not always necessarily the most attractive woodland, though there are surprising woodland pieces too. And I view it as connecting all the major high density housing, the shopping centers. We have a large number of employers right along Route 9 with office buildings, connecting all those together so that people could get on a bike instead of fighting traffic down Route 9. I started walking around doing this in some of these neighborhoods, just talking to them. I was surveying, and somebody said, "Well, what are you out here doing?" And I started saying it, and they said, there were people who were telling me, "Oh, I work in Framingham, or I work in Worcester. If you get this thing built, I'm buying an e-bike and getting on it and heading to work. I'm not going to put up with traffic anymore." And there's so many things like that can happen. Value. And the spurs are what are critical. One of the other recent mistakes of the town is let's make it cheaper. So they got rid of a whole bunch of the spurs that were in the feasibility study that I developed for the trail. Well, I identified that they have disconnected almost 1,500 bedrooms, which in 1, 2, and 3 bedroom apartment type situations that would have been connected to the trail. Think of how many people that is. It's well over 2,000 people, or probably 10% of the community of the town is now being cut off from the trail, or is going to have to drive their car a quarter mile, find a place to park to get on the trail to use it, rather than just walking out their door and using it.
I wouldn't be too disappointed with that because a lot of the people who make the decisions on these newfangled ideas are, let's just call them 20th century people, and they don't really understand the importance here. The fact that they have done that disappoints you, certainly, but I would say that those missed opportunities for connections can be implemented later. It's not as if those connections have gone away. They've just not been connected properly yet.
That's true, but using the state's trail cost estimating tool, it's going to be, or the connections, one of which is also to the MBTA station, which you would have hoped that they would have thought of, is going to cost $4 to $5 million. And I'm not convinced that the state is willing to come up for doing we need a quarter-mile trail that leads to a private apartment complex, or one that leads to two shopping centers over here, that they're going to be willing to cough up the money. We can fix this, but it may be town money, and rather than an integrated plan to the state.
Yeah, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. I believe you're looking at the world from your point of view of these suburban communities in central Mass. They're not cities, they're towns, and towns in Massachusetts tend to be, to a lesser greater degree, on the frail side. Maybe not the four F's, which means frail, forlorn, forgotten, and another F. But your communities are not that. They're just towns and frugal. And I would not be too disappointed yet. I think we're going to be at a tipping point here shortly. Just in my steam railroad corridor realm, we have the densest network of dead steam railroad corridor in North America, within 150 miles where I'm sitting here. And this is the deciders of the 21st century who are becoming more and more prevalent, not 20th century deciders, 21st century deciders. This is going to be more commonplace, and they'll look at this as well, that's just a mistake from years past. They didn't see the vision. New people coming in, the deciders of the 21st century, will say, they made a mistake, but we're going to correct that. And so, even with the trail that I live adjacent to here in the Florence neighborhood of Northampton, there's at least 6 places where dead end streets that come right up to the dead steam railroad corridor weren't connected. There's a grade change, and it's really not comfortable to get from the trail down to the street. And they were never implemented as a connection. Now they are. Not all at once, not quickly. Obviously, we've been in the ground here 42 years, and they're just getting around to connecting it to dead end streets so people can get from their house easily, just like you described. Things will come. Things will happen there. Here's a good one. How do you identify priority destinations from the start?
When I did the concept plan, I looked at and identified all the major office buildings, all the major retail areas, all the dense housing areas, all the schools, and all the open space. And the concept plan actually had a map that showed all of these as part of the concept. And from the beginning, I described it as not just oh, we're building a trail and you can use it, all the benefits, all the interconnection. The concept plan, I started the first one, went through 3 drafts from 2007 to 2012. But in each one, I was emphasizing all the benefits to the community, not just that, oh, we're doing a great trail, or let me show you where the trails could be and what it's going to be like, but also the benefits, the things like looking at how much commuting was being done from town to town using federal census data and pointing out that we could move a lot of that. There were a lot of people commuting from one town to another, and most of them were using cars. And if we could move some of that off onto the bike trail, we'd reduce the congestion, which they continually look at as how to solve the congestion on Route 9. And I said, here's a solution for some of that. And so it's really a message to get this across. And I still make maps even till today of all the benefits, including the environmental justice, which the state is very concerned with, and that show how the trail was connecting a lot of this together.
Here's some other good questions here. I'm looking at the list here. How do you, and this really struck a chord with me because of the busyness you mentioned on Route 9 in your neighborhood with all the professional office suites there. And it's not really malls. There's some commercial retail businesses there, but for the most part, my vision of your area as professional offices. And how do you persuade developers, the owners of those developments, how do you get them to support shared use paths and connect their facilities into your pathway network?
I approach it 2 ways. One, I talk about the benefits to their current tenants. And it was amazing. I was sitting down with one of the first groups and I said, look, we'll have a connection that will go over to the shopping center, which has a number of restaurants. It's about 1.5 miles away. And the vice president for this development company said, you mean I could hop on an e-bike and be over there in 15 minutes or so for lunch or something, and without having to, because it takes me longer than that to get there with my car because of all the backup. And he got excited on that. But beyond that, I then pulled out, because I had gone through League of American Bicyclists bike-friendly businesses and chosen some of the big ones, and actually had a slide that had all the logos of about 50 major businesses who were all bike friendly. And I said, these are the types of clients you might be attracting, because you now have bike facilities for your people, because they actually spend money to make their facilities more friendly and want to be in communities that are going to be bicycle friendly. And they started getting really excited. And so also I I've taken advantage of my consulting in the past. And once in a while I hear of a client from my computer consulting days who's looking for new office space. And I always point them to the people who are helping us with the bike trail as a payback, if I can, to at least help them get going. And I urge other people, other supporters of the trail, to do the same thing. And so they get a few nibbles, and most of the developers really appreciate that.
That's great. I'm glad to hear that. And then your deciders at the municipal level too, they're going to be very excited to hear that the owners of those complexes are coming on board.
Yeah, not only coming on board, but I mean, it was Westboro now has Amazon in it. And I'm not saying that the trail brought in Amazon, but by the same token, since Amazon was a bike friendly business, I had that on my slide, and they are helping us build part of the trail in the community.
Wow, that's great. How can advocates work effectively with state agencies like the MWRA, as you mentioned earlier? What do you suggest on that?
First thing is you they're not going to be, they don't really want to hear a lot of calls from people. They're trying to be friendly, but if you go to your legislators, find a legislative advocate to get to get them to at least sit down and hear you out, because it's going to take a little time. And you just call or send them a letter, it's probably going to get put off to the side. But if somebody who's helping sign off on the bills that they need to operate their organization, they're going to at least take a little more time. And as I say, understand their concerns. I finally found out why for years they've been telling me the aqueduct is not buildable as a trail. They actually do have a valid concern that over 100 years ago, they put in the tunnel that the aqueduct is in, and it's unreinforced concrete. It's not super strong, and they're concerned that if we start bringing in heavy duty equipment to run right on top of the aqueduct to lay down asphalt or even stone dust, that we're going to damage the aqueduct. It may mean that we're spending some more money, but the aqueduct right of way is more than wide enough. The aqueduct is only about 10 feet wide. The aqueduct right of way is typically 50 to 100 feet wide through the whole region. So we may have to be more inventive, but we can solve this problem if that's really what the blocking thing is, as well as talking to some people from MassDOT yesterday, because or a couple days ago, we had a ceremony on Monday opening up a bridge that it is going to be part of connecting a bike and ped bridge to connect the T station into some of the work the town's doing to both get downtown and for BWalt. And they were saying you can reduce the amount of the weight of what you're doing for building if you do have to build on top. And yes, they're worried about ambulances. And so I'm now hoping to talk to the emergency services people, because in many cases, there's a road close enough that I don't think you have to drive on the bike trail if there's a problem and you need to get somebody there. And come up with an approach that will solve their concern and move forward. And we did that when we built the walking trail through the plant. We actually offered the phone numbers and contact data. So they said, if you feel there's a security threat, we'll go out and close the trail. I don't care if you call us in the middle of the night. We'll go out there and put up signs and at least tell people, do not continue on through your plant. And things like that help them a lot to be willing to talk to us and work.
That's good. Let's also along that line, what's the best way to approach businesses for trail easements? As you know, this is now talking about the private sector here.
In the private sector, any landowner, the first thing is see if you can find somebody who's an advocate or who's a friend of the trail who knows the person. If you have somebody who already knows, you're halfway there, because you can get them to help you get in the door. The second thing is understand their business and what benefits the trail can bring, and make sure those benefits are highlighted. As I said, with the developers of office parks, it was both an amenity and whatever, but it's amazing. CarMax in Westboro, when we approached them, it turned out they were building their facility, or they actually had it partially open already. And it turned out a lot of their people were walking the quarter-mile down the old trolley right of way to get to a shopping center where there were a number of fast food restaurants and other things, so that they could grab lunch. And we said, this will now be an improved trail that'll be maintained, and it's not just guys wandering through the woods, but will be a legal public right of way. And even though they're a car-oriented business, so you don't expect people to go there on a bike to buy a car, it's benefiting their employees because they don't have to get out on the road and a divided highway like Route 9, they actually had to drive about 3 miles to to do the quarter-mile chop, pick up the lunch and come back type of thing.
How do reports and studies influence trail development in your realm here?
I try to track all this, which one of the challenges I have right now is that there's been a lot of presentations and a lot of studies talking about shared use paths at present. And so if you look at the last 2 years, all major documents that dictate what a shared use path will look like have been revised. The ADA standards, the AASHTO bike standards, the NACTO bike guidance, the state's project development and design guide that it has a section on shared use paths and what you need if you want to go on tip. Every single one of those documents has been revised, and you have to think about those. But also, when I write documents, I try to convey something in a way that people will understand and realize where we're trying to get and convey better what the message is. And there's a lot of things we can do.
Well, that's great. That's great. What advice would you give new trail advocates facing similar challenges?
There's a lot of things here on that, and it's hard to say. One of the things would be to continuously work to educate the community. It was one of the mistakes I actually made. I got involved with the community. I thought the town was jumping in, and the town did jump in, but I didn't convey the vision continuously. And so the vision slipped. Some of the mistakes that the community is making is they've looked at various trails that, next to where they live or whatever, a lot of which were primarily recreational trails, whereas Bewalt is primarily a commuting trail. It's going to be used by a lot of people for recreation, but it's also, because it crosses a lot of roads, it's a little less friendly than taking the Mass Central, particularly in some place like Wachusett Greenways or out where you have miles, 2 or 3 miles between a road crossing. We have places where it's a quarter mile between a road crossing, which is not as pleasant to ride. But we have other benefits because of all these businesses and other things that we talked about earlier. And you need to think about what the use of the trail is. And the best way to do that is, once you understand how the trail can be best used, make sure you continue, that everybody understands that, both the officials in town as well as the voters, because the voters will notice if the officials start deviating and go, it's time to, let's fix this. And I let that slip for a while. The town took over and I got busy with some other things because I do other trail advocacy besides just the Bewalt.
Okay. What inspires you, Don, to keep pushing despite setbacks?
First thing is believe in yourself and the vision. I tell right now, for instance, about 9 years ago, Mass Wildlife started saying we don't want trails in our properties and the like. But I remembered when I was first building it, and I did have permission from Mass Wildlife, we were cutting some new trails and mainly clearing out some of their old trails to make them more usable and friendly to walkers and hunters. I would get hunters coming up and saying, thank you for the work. So I knew that there was the value, and the hunters, even the users of Mass Wildlife land, the ones who were concerned about a lot of this, liked what I was doing. So even though they've said no, I am now still working and have some legislators who are asking Mass Wildlife questions. And I'm hoping at some point to be able to sit down to see if we can break this log jam and get that reopened to some degree, obviously with controls and to meet their concerns. it's taking 10 years and it'll probably take me a while longer. It can take a long time, but just if you believe, it can happen.
That's great. What kept you going when your town didn't want trails?
It's true that when I first proposed Pewalt, the first two town planners said it's never gonna happen. And part of me said, okay, I need to learn some more. And that's actually why I started the walking trail network, because I could do walking trails without town support. And even there, I was on a town committee, the Open Space Preservation Committee, which, among other things, should have been thinking about trails. And when I first asked them, they said no. So I spent time and
The Open
explored.
Space Committee was not interested in trails?
They said there was no place to build them in town. As a consultant, I hit a dead period a few years later. And so I went out and started walking every trail. And this was before GPSs were easily available. So I took the topo maps for the town, put them on a poster board, and actually drew in all the existing trails, including most of which were never on any trail map in town, as well as between the town's open space committee protecting land, and we got in a local land trust started the protecting land, all the land that was going to be available to build trails on and draw, and found I could get 3/4 of the way around town on a loop. I took it into the Open Space Preservation Committee, which also had a number of members of the board members of the land trust on it, and put it up. And the first words were, my God, how do we get the rest of the way to make it a complete loop? That was the first reaction. None of this, but
Visionary.
this was fall of 1999, and within 2 months, both the Open Space Committee and the Land Trust had adopted it. And a month or so later, we went to the Board of Selectmen and presented it, and the town adopted it as an official project. And we started building the first trail that summer, which was 25 years ago this year. And last Sunday was the closest date to the first hike we were going to lead. And I have an email from the head of the land trust saying it'll be a great walk if we have 15 to 20 people. It'll be a great event. I drive over there with my wife, and there were 75 people standing there waiting for me to lead them through the woods.
Oh, wow.
And we realized we had a referendum.
Yes.
And this first mile or so of trail we built at the time, the town had 25 miles of walking trails. We have 60 now.
Wow.
In 25 years. Just so if you can get over that initial challenge, and that took about 8 to 9 years to even for the walking trail, it can go. And once you get the people behind you, you can do almost anything.
This is great, Don. This is great. Have you ever heard of the 3 stages of truth?
No.
I'm going to ask that of all my podcast guests because you remember Dick Williamson, right?
Yes.
Sudbury. He passed away recently.
Yeah, Dick is an old friend even before I got involved with trails. So
you weren't at his memorial service. I don't remember seeing
no.
you there. This was at a town park, Davis Field, I think it was called. And there was a couple of hundred people there. This was about 3 weeks ago now. And I was there and I just had to speak up, and I looked at all these people there, the full spectrum of age, from his grandkids and other neighborhood kids to old elders around, and other people I knew in the rail trail world for the last 30 years. I looked at them all and I said, have you ever heard of the 3 stages of truth? And they said, no. And I had never heard of that either until very recently. In my real estate practice, I talk to people all the time, and they always say to me, Craig, what did you do before you became a realtor? I said, years ago, I used to market rail freight and plan the startup of big major transloading facilities throughout southern New England. And then I was hired by Rails to Trails Conservancy because I had started writing a few books on the subject. I have a background in railroad history. And there were pushback, there were people opposed to the trails. And people were saying to me, and this happens almost every day to me, what do you mean? People were opposed to that? And it became apparent to me, and I discovered it just by accident. There was a German philosopher who, in the 1850s, came up with this three stages of truth concept. No matter what the newfangled idea was, it'll always be the first stage of truth. People will scoff at that. Ah, that's never going to happen. Then the second stage is when, to a degree, they become seeing that you're real and intending to do this, and then they become a really hard-bitten dead-ender opponents to some lesser or greater degree. And then the third stage of truth is, who could be opposed to that? And I told the people at Dick Williamson's memorial service that, and they had no idea. And I said, I've been planning to start up this podcast, and I have to now steer it towards the folks that are the elder statesmen, the Obi-Wan Kenobis in the Star Wars parlance. People have been around. And I looked at his family and I said, I'm so sorry that I never had the opportunity to put Dick on my podcast here, because we can't let people know, we can't let people forget how important and how hard this was to build this network. Here we are witnessing the greatest reclamation of wasteland in North America. And within southern New England here, in eastern New York, and a little bit of Vermont and New Hampshire, is the densest network of dead steam railroad corridor. And it was so hard to get this going. And it's going to be all built out eventually. But we can't let people forget that it wasn't easy to build and just a fluke and flimsy thing. And oh my God. No, there were people that dedicated their lives. As a matter of fact, the same week that Dick Williamson passed on was another guy who was monumental here in southern New England, the Bob Armstrong, who Bob and Sue Armstrong were major supporters of the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail. And they used to hold events at their house. David Burwell, founder of Rails to Trails Conservancy, and I used to show up there every year to talk about the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail or other trails in general. Bob just passed on too. And so this is going to be very impactful to have this live forever, all these conversations here, to awaken people that this is our gift to you, to have this thing for the future.
To finish, to give you my three stages of truth now that I know what it means. When we built that first piece of trail, we had a petition by 90 people to stop the trail, the walking trail. And I was told, and so we stopped it in the middle of the woods in a meadow, small meadow. The next year we built it out into where these 90 people lived, because we actually owned land. We owned frontage on their street. We built it there. And they said, okay, it was okay. The following year we went back and had always intended to put a loop in that open space. We put in the loop. 18 months later, I'm working with a company and I'm invited to a party over there by the vice president. And he says, the trail you put in was okay, but if you ever put in that loop, it would destroy the whole neighborhood. And I looked at him and I said, it's been in for 18 months and none of you even know about it. And I said, the other thing you should be aware of is 4 of your neighbors, their kids, discovered the trail and demanded that the parents help. And so they have now taken over maintaining the trail, and we don't have to maintain it because people in your own subdivision who were against it and were on that petition are now the ones out there working on weekends to make sure the trail's in good shape.
Jeez.
So
That's perfect, Don. That's perfect.
that's in 5 years, my 3 stages of the truth on one small piece of my trail efforts.
That's great.
Thank you.
Right.
Have a
Talk
good
to you
one.
later.
Yep.
Thanks for tuning in to Roads Less Traveled with Craig Della Penna. I hope today's episode gave you fresh ideas and inspiration for exploring the unique world of real estate, rail trails, and bike tourism. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share the show so we can reach more trail lovers and real estate enthusiasts like you. Stay connected, stay curious, and I'll see you next week with more expert insights and stories from the Roads Less Traveled.